Hello, and welcome to episode 97 of the Sci-Fi Podcast from Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Mazviita Chirimuuta, Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. All science needs to simplify, but when the object of research is something as complicated as the brain, this challenge can stretch the limits of scientific possibility. In fact, in her book, The Brain Abstracted, an avowedly opinionated history of neuroscience, Mazviita argues that due to the brain's complexity, neuroscientific theories have only captured partial truths, and neurophilosophy is unlikely to be achieved. Looking at the theory and practice of neuroscience, both past and present, Mazviita shows how the science has been shaped by the problem of brain complexity and the need in science to make things as simple as possible. From this history, Mazviita draws lessons for debates in philosophy of science over the limits and definition of science, and in philosophy of mind over explanations of consciousness and the mind-body problem. The Brain Abstracted is the product of a historical rupture that has become visible in the 21st century between the classical scientific approach, which seeks simple, intelligible principles underlying the manifest complexity of nature, and a data-driven engineering approach which dispenses with the search for elegant explanatory laws and models. In the space created by this rupture, Chirimuuta finds grounds for theoretical and practical humility. Her aim in The Brain Abstracted is not to reform neuroscience or offer advice to neuroscientists, but rather to interpret their work and to suggest a new framework for interpreting the philosophical significance of neuroscience. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Mazviita. All right, Dr. Mazviita Chirimuuta, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday afternoon?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's good to finally connect. I'm so happy to have you on. How are things out in the UK?
Well, in Edinburgh specifically, there is the festival right now. So it takes up most of August. So you have the International Festival, which is quite highbrow art, performances, music, and also you have the Fringe Festival, which is quite lowbrow, a whole bunch of different comedians in the making, as well as, established, actually quite sophisticated performances. So yeah, there's so much to choose from. So I've been enjoying some of those shows.
Wonderful. Can you, so as a fan of comedy myself, not necessarily only the lowbrow things, but just, I would say artistic or new kinds of variety acts and shows. Yeah. Have there been any, like, what is it like to go to these performances and be a part of the sort of artistic energy there?
Yeah, it actually feels quite inspiring. It's just this moment where there's just so much happening and just finding out about all of these different creative activities that are going on, it makes you feel, well, there is a world of stuff happening out there. So it's been good. Yeah, yesterday, I went to a performance which really did pair the highbrow with the lowbrow. So it was called 300 Paintings, and it's by an Australian comedian turned artist turned comedian again, called Sam Kisajunan. And he described how he had a career in stand-up, then got disillusioned, and then during a manic episode just told himself he was going to become an artist, and actually started painting and doing all kinds of amazing installations and creations before, like, after 6 months crashing, having to put everything back together again and following a depressive episode because he's bipolar. And then the performance was actually about this process. So he was telling this very funny account of how he became an artist and about, all of the different problems that arose in his life, but also the amazing creativity that was just there in that period, and that he says is still there, though it's more under control because he's now seeing a psychiatrist. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. That's exactly the kind of show I would love to see. Just those kind of retellings and those interesting, just unique perspectives. Yeah, I'll definitely have to make it out there sometime. And so in terms of you're in Edinburgh, in terms of, so you're senior lecturer there in the philosophy department.
That's right.
That's right. And so, are you gearing up for the, how does it work? Are there semesters there, or is it, what schedule are you on?
Yeah, we have 2 semesters, and our first semester of the year will be starting in mid-September, so there's a little bit of time left. I'm actually on research leave this term. So
nice. Congratulations.
Funded by the Royal Society and Leverhulme Trust, which is funding a collaboration with someone at Glasgow Caledonian, which is actually a bit of a philosophy science collaboration, because the person I'm working with, Juan Perilla, he's an engineer, chemical engineer. He does AI based research as well. He's interested in origins of life and origins of cognition. So my role in this collaboration is to talk a bit about these questions of how we define cognition, especially for systems without nervous system is very unlike us. So it's linking to this new debate in philosophy and cognitive science over basal cognition, which I've been interested in for a while. So this is a chance for me to find out more about that.
Wonderful. Oh, and how has that been going so far?
Yeah, well, so Juanma, his part of the project is due to start soon. So I've spent this year so far, this calendar year so far, doing the background reading, drafting initial papers, of staking out my view on this. So the collaborative part is yet to happen, but no, it's been fun. Learned a lot.
Great. So I was just going to say, I've spoken with a number of philosophers of science who've engaged in interesting ways with scientists, generally, let's say biomedical researchers, but this might be one of the first in terms of someone who's in robotics and mechanical engineering. So it sounds like you have yet to begin the collaboration, but is there anything you're thinking about in terms of how to make it a successful collaboration when doing a project like this?
I'm pretty much going to just see how it goes. I haven't. I'm not going in with a meta theory of how the collaboration should look. I mean, there's definitely things that we've written on the grant proposal, which will be like specific papers that we'll be trying to thrash out. I mean, I should say chemical. I said chemical engineering. So he works on these origin of life systems, which are oil droplets, and he is doing AI simulations of them. So a key question that I have as a philosopher of science is actually how much you can learn through simulation, and so really actually working with someone and hearing directly from someone using this methodology. It's a chance to like be on the coalface, so have that back and forth dialogue. Okay, really, what are you trying to do here? How can you really achieve this? So it's really the opportunity to be there in close contact with research as it happens that I think is really productive for getting insights into these methodological issues.
Well, perhaps we'll circle back to this current project and think a little bit more about that. But before that, why don't we take a step back, Mazviita, and learn a little bit more about your origins in terms of how you came into studying philosophy, how you ended up as a professional philosopher of science, studying philosophy of neuroscience. So tell us, Mazviita, where did you grow up?
Well, we talked a little bit about this before the show, but I wanted to ask you, why do you ask the question?
Oh, geez. Putting me, but yes, we did. We putting me on the spot. Well, so, I mean, I guess one of the, perhaps an immediate answer that I can think of relates to that. I personally, for our listeners and myself, I find it always fascinating to learn about, the kinds of different backgrounds and perspectives that, people, sort of originate from and that informs and they bring into their, I say, philosophical thinking or ideas and expertise. I think sometimes there is a standard narrative in terms of those in academia that people essentially were bookish and came through this particular storied life to then just kind of remain in school. And that is often the case, because we love school. Why, do that? Yeah. But people have very different sort of backgrounds and ideas. And I think it's interesting, especially when you ask some more open-ended questions, not related to a person's work, what kinds of thoughts and ideas come out. So I guess those are some of my immediate questions, but what did you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, also myself, I mean, I'm interested in that relationship between philosophy and life, because I've been doing this for long enough now in academia that I ask myself even more than I used to. So why this? Is it for reasons that were, what were the, if you like, the deeper psychological reasons for this choice? And in questions like things that go back to your childhood, and you can connect things in all kinds of different ways. I mean, to go back to your question, where I grew up, I had in my early years quite an itinerant childhood. It was all in England, but my mother was a doctor in training, which meant we moved every 18 months or so, and we didn't have extended family around us. So it was quite a dislocated childhood, except for a few years that we lived in Bristol, and that was the first town that really felt like it had become a home. This was primary school years, and then I had to move from there when I was 9. And it's one of the main reasons I ended up going back to university there as an undergraduate, because I did really miss that city. But yeah, overall, I didn't have a particularly happy childhood, and probably mostly avoid talking about it. But I'm sure
Sounds
that
challenging. Yeah,
my choice to go into philosophy as a choice for undergraduate study, reflecting on difficult situations, and what are the challenges of adult life and life in general, and philosophy is one of those subjects that offers you the chance to think deeply about a whole range of things. And interestingly, it also provides a certain amount of like intellectual escapism into your own head.
I would agree with that. I think, yeah, I love what you've done, and I can similarly do the same thing of sometimes questioning not only what we're doing, but like, why are we doing this, or what do we find so fascinating about it, or what is it about us that is allowing us to experience or make sense of or cope with life in a number of different ways. And I think philosophy as a sort of a practice, a method, a quasi art, or sort of something, can touch on that in a way that, I mean, it's, again, people approach philosophy and philosophy of science, I imagine, distinctly, and some can use it more as a thinking tool, but some it tends to draw more deeply into others in terms of what it allows us. And so I always thought about, like, myself when I think about what I mentioned, like I was interested in theater as well. And I thought, like, why do I do theater? It's not just because I like getting on stage or because I like play. I mean, that's part of it, but part of it is, one, it provides a sense of community. Like, it provides a sense of motivation and willingness. It does provide that sense of escape. It provides a sense of order in perhaps like a disordered or an unordered way, which is life. I think it was Tennessee Williams, the playwright, who said something related to, like, he ended up writing lots of plays because it's like, this is some sense of order that I can find in a very disordered and disillusioned world. Yeah.
Definitely come to the Edinburgh Festival one year, because included in the Fringe, there are so many 1-hour plays, not just comedy, but also
wonderful,
serious ones. But people just putting all of that, because there's so many things that people just do 1-hour plays, and you can just see such a range of different styles and ideas that people are coming up with. Yeah.
So it sounds like philosophy in many ways was sort of a saving grace for a difficult and challenging childhood. Was this something that you found like in sort of like early secondary school years, or was, some people a lot of times first find a science of some kind, or was it sort of writing and philosophy for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say having the chance to just think seriously about, what it meant to be growing up into adult life. I think there's something that appealed to me, just the idea of what philosophy is. It's about understanding life in general, human existence. I didn't go through a very heavy existentialist phase like some people did. I mean, in terms of reading the French existentialists, I do remember reading a couple of books by Camus and a couple of novels by Sartre, but I didn't love them, especially the Sartre. I can't say I was really that fond of that. But I would say what actually grabbed me the most in terms of philosophy as a subject choice going into undergraduate is because in the English education system, you're forced really young, at the age of 16, to make this decision. Are you a science person or are you a humanities person? And I'd always sort of found myself to be like quite keen on, like maybe excessively keen on both sets of subjects. So I really like doing the sciences, really like doing the languages, with the exception of English language. I didn't particularly enjoy those lessons, but I really liked foreign languages and history. And so I didn't want to have to be forced to make that choice. Though for my A-level choices, these are the school leaving exams, I managed to do a bit of both. And then I found out, well, for university, there is this subject philosophy, and I must have been doing a fair amount of reading, just like intro, what is philosophy, books that really, I saw that philosophy sort of captured what is on offer intellectually in both sides that you have with the sciences and the humanities. And I think that's really what gripped me about it then and still does today. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So, well, yeah, that is an interesting decision point. I remember learning about that a bit, and that's a challenging one to put, but good on you for sort of managing to sort of approach those in a very sort of creative and thoughtful way. So what went into your decision in terms of, you mentioned, I think it was early, finishing your PhD fairly quickly, but what went into your decision to pursue philosophy professionally?
Oh, well, that's actually a longer story. So when I was an undergraduate at Bristol, I graduated with philosophy and psychology, and I had the idea that there was a lot to offer from the sciences in terms of addressing one of these long-standing philosophical questions. Especially started to learn a bit about neuroscience from the modules in my psychology degree. But because I really had taken to philosophy as a subject that I really liked a lot, almost to the extent of like identifying with it, this is who I am. I finally, in that, way that you do when you're a young adult just coming to the end of adolescence, like what kind of person am I? I really felt like I had identified with this. But then almost perversely, I decided not to do a PhD in philosophy. I got an opportunity instead to do more research in a lab in vision science. And I started as an undergraduate with my graduating in psychology project to do my own experimental work. And I had a very encouraging lecturer, the late Tom Toshianko, who really sort of helped me design my own experiments, enabled me to present them at conferences. And I was quite taken with the lab life. And actually, I didn't get that kind of encouragement out of the philosophers that I knew. So there's a bunch of scientists saying, oh, you should do further work with us. Come and try and do a PhD. And I was like, oh, I really felt like a philosopher, but there weren't any other philosophers encouraging me. So I ended up, going down the science path for my PhD.
Wow. Okay. So, and you said, so what was, what was it like then working toward that in the sciences?
Yeah, I went to Cambridge at that point, and my supervisor is a guy called David Tolhurst. He's a proper neuroscientist in the sense that the first part of his career was doing single cell recordings in primary visual cortex of cats and other animals. So really sort of getting to grips with the precise physiological properties of neurons in these brain areas. But by the time I joined his lab, he'd switched to psychophysics. I think one of the reasons he told me for the switch is that he had pet cats and he just didn't feel like doing experiments on cats anymore. And so psychophysics is this kind of experimental method where you're doing very precise measurements of sensory thresholds in humans. So we typically use ourselves as subjects because when you're dealing with responses which are due to physiology and quite early visual system, the results are quite generalized across different subjects. So it doesn't matter that you're an experimenter or naive to the tasks. We did also bring in subjects, participants in experiments that weren't lab members as well, because you have to do that, of course. But yeah, we spent a lot of time collecting data on ourselves, looking at images on the screen, making very small differences to the contrast in those images, and then ultimately then looking to see through modeling, so the kind of data that we got on primary visual cortex neurons, if we could then explain the response profiles that we got in a psychophysics in terms of the operation of populations of neurons. So it was still combining the V1 physiology, but yeah, the experimental work I was doing was psychophysics.
Oh yeah, so you're a scientist through and through. Of course. I'm sorry I let this go in my background research. I mean, I know you do science, but like PhD in physiology, working in psychophysics labs. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, that's the qualification that I came out with, because I never actually went back to philosophy to get a PhD. So I don't have a PhD in philosophy.
That's okay. So, well, this is a fascinating story then, because I think you might be the first maybe one of the first. I think we have some other folks with PhDs in psych, but I don't know. So what is the story then in terms of, obviously you had some sort of introduction and sort of connection in, early life in philosophy, but had ultimately found your way into essentially a scientific career path. How did that then change back and transition perhaps toward where you are, moving toward philosophy of color, philosophy of neuroscience, things like that? Yeah.
Well, the philosophy bug never left me while I was doing my PhD. So even as though I had this enthusiasm from when I was an undergraduate, and I carried on reading, so based on kind of modules that I'd studied as an undergraduate, which was fairly wide. I mean, I did a bit of history of philosophy, did a lot of Wittgenstein in my final year, as well as philosophy of mind, philosophy of physics. And so I just sort of carried on reading widely. And also my department, where I had my lab, was very close to the HPS department in Cambridge, because the HPS department is part of the it's in the science complex in Cambridge. They have the History of Science Museum there, just a few doors down from Zoology Museum and other sciencey museums as well. And so I used to go to seminars there. Two of my current colleagues were in the HPS department at the time, so Mark Spivak and Michaela Massimi. Michaela Massimi was a postdoc, and Mark Spivak was a PhD student working with Peter Lipton. So, and now we're all together at Edinburgh, which is nice. Really
That's great.
So yeah, I used to just informally go to HPS seminars and just try and keep learning. They had also this quite imposing evening seminar series at Cambridge called the Moral Sciences Club. I used to attend that regularly, and it was my first experience of just hearing professional talks in philosophy.
Wow. Okay. So there was still something going on. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I was spending spending time still trying to learn more philosophy in my spare time. And then when it got towards the end of PhDs, I was thinking about what to do next. So the thing is, one of the nice things about science PhDs is there's not this big crunch at the end, like, will I get a job? Because there are always postdocs, because basically postdocs are part of a labor force. People
That's how the science gets done. Yeah.
So I was never concerned that I would be unemployed. And in fact, my first postdoc was in a lab. This was in Italy with two really well-respected vision scientists, Dave Burr and Concetta Morone, who I went to with a fest trip for Dave Burr in Florence last year, which was fantastic, and it's really nice. They invited me back. But yeah, I managed to get a first postdoc lined up, and it was to do a project which involved colour vision for the first time, because my PhD research was all on black and white vision. But as I had me finishing my PhD, I started just out out of the blue, emailing a bunch of philosophers of neuroscience, just saying, how do I get into philosophy of neuroscience? Is there anything I could do? And one person was kind enough to write back enthusiastically. This is Ian Gold. He's now at McGill University, but he was then at Monash University in Australia, and said, I've done work on colour and philosophy. I'd be really interested in collaborating with a vision scientist. And he was amazing. He wrote a grant proposal for me to take a 3-year postdoc with him out at Monash. And that was what got me into philosophy and colour perception, the project that ended up being my first book, Outside Colour. And having that length of time, like 3 years, like spending the whole time doing research on a specific project in philosophy, it was effectively like doing another PhD. So PhDs in the British system is just 3 years of research, and by the end of it you have a dissertation, and that's pretty much how it was for me. Wow. So yeah, unofficially I felt like I got a second PhD.
So what kinds of questions when you were reaching out to folks, philosophers of neuroscience, perhaps interested in color, what kinds of questions were on your mind?
What kinds of, for questions that I wanted to pursue as a philosopher?
Yes.
I see.
Or even just things you were thinking about. I mean, I'm sort of still trying to understand, especially those, if the philosophy hadn't left and you're doing some experimental work, but you're wanting this maybe to explore these things a little bit more deeply or methodologically, how do you go from thinking about doing science and some of these things to then asking deeper questions, and what kinds of questions? What were those?
Yeah. I mean, I would say one of the reasons that I was attracted to vision science as a science is because of the epistemological interest of vision as this modality. It does feel to us as that access to reality. So those questions about, does vision itself present the world as it is to us, or does it not? That's one of the things that gripped me about studying the science of vision in the first place. And then you learn about all of these intricate mechanisms that seem to almost get in the way of perceiving reality, or or is that what makes reality show up for us? So I have to say, when I was emailing these different philosophers, I wasn't saying this isn't the research question I want to answer. It's just like, is there anything for me to do? But what was nice about the colour project is that it allowed me to ask those kinds of questions, because it's particularly with colour vision that this dubiousness about, is our experience actually giving us access to reality, or is it this illusion? Is it this projection that the brain makes up, and then we see the world in colour, but colours aren't really out there in the physical world? This is where these kinds of issues get debated.
Okay. Great. And so in terms of switching from a career pursuing and continuing to pursue an experimentalist career and going toward a career in philosophy, was there certain kind of catch up that you needed to do, or that you found in some of your fellowships or postdocs?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of professionalization, it was really just trying to figure out things as I went along, to some extent. I mean, Ian Gold was really great and encouraging, and as soon as I had a paper drafted, he encouraged me to present that, and I was able to get used to acting like a philosopher. Sure. I mean, certainly the publication round, I certainly went through that. Everyone has this experience with their first papers. You can it's hard to land things with journals, and I say by the end of the 3-year postdoc I got one article in a good journal that I was really pleased with. But just learning the ropes of that, obviously it's a slow and arduous process, and I just had to go through that. But in terms of just background reading of content, I mean, just in terms of the literature and philosophy of colour, I just remember spending hours and hours by myself going through that, and then going to Ian with questions about that, because obviously I didn't have actual seminars in this as you do with with PhDs in the States.
Right. So,
but I also, as a
postdoc,
got a chance to teach a course that was at Monash as well. So I managed to teach a class to undergraduates now in philosophy of colour, so I got a bit of experience in that way.
Right. So you've kind of alluded to this in terms of your primary questions, but I know you have 2 books, and I want to talk about your most recent one. But first, I was curious about your initial book, your introductory or Outside Color: Perceptual Science and the Puzzle of Color and Philosophy. Mm-hmm. What were some of the main claims? What went into this book, and what are some of your takeaways from the experience?
Yeah, well, I went into this project in philosophy of perception with the idea that, okay, we have this sort of long-running puzzle about what color is it real or not? And now we have all of this interesting science on how the color visual systems work. So really bringing the second thing to bear on the first. And that is essentially what the book tries to do. It argues for a specific theory of color ontology, namely that colors are not properties of objects out there in the world or of brain states or mental states, but actually properties of interactions between the perceiver and the environment. So it's, if you like, a processual theory of color. It says that, I call it color adverbialism. The catchphrase is that instead of saying that the apple is red, you say that you see the apple redly.
Okay.
Right, so it's a property of the visual performance. But it's one that's a relational theory of color, because colors turn out to be dependent both on the existence of a perceiver and something in the environment that is being perceived. So that's the main takeaways, and I argue for this in the book by drawing on literature with both in neuroscience, psychology, and a bit on the ecology of color perception as well. I would say in the background of this view is definitely the influence of J.J. Gibson, mm-hmm. who's the famous theorist of ecological perception, someone that Tom Shoshanko had introduced me to in his lectures years ago, and sort of stuck in my mind that this is a really useful way of thinking about vision. And also some of my PhD work was also on this issue of how the visual system is precisely tuned to certain variables that exist, statistics that exist in the natural world, as opposed to any arbitrary artificial kind of stimulus. So really about that perceiver environment connection.
So
something that had been running through my experience as a vision scientist.
So it's what's interesting, and perhaps this is maybe standard now, but when I was, speaking with philosophers and perhaps philosophers of color, I wasn't always sure to what degree they were engaged with particular science or scientific theories or vision scientists. And it sounds like you were able to do that, to bring in some ideas or sort of see the connections between certain things as an ability to help solve philosophical problems.
Well, that's the thing, because I backed away from the hope that science by itself would help solve these philosophical puzzles. Because one thing that I noticed, and this actually was turned into that paper that I got published as a postdoc, was that science is not a neutral arbiter on any of these philosophical questions about the nature of perception, because science itself contains philosophical background assumptions. And so you can think that, a scientist has demonstrated that, the reverse inference approach to visual processing is the correct one, but really it's just really quite deeply baked into their whole approach that we need to think about perception as a kind of reverse inference, for example, and these are the examples that I give in the papers, and so this made me, I guess, in some way disappointed that I thought there would be this neat path from science to philosophy which would constitute a kind of progress, because through the marriage of these two disciplines, finally we'd have the tools to get clear answers on these issues, and that is a approach to the philosophy neuroscience relationship that I'd seen with people like Patricia Churchland, who's really in the the most well-known philosopher of neuroscience at the time. Had really set the agenda for the discipline.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing your feelings about the subject as well. I can understand that disappointment as you learn and think more deeply about these kinds of things. It's not nearly as neat and how you would hope it. I mean, sometimes things can surprise you, but I share that experience. Well, so you've done a tremendous amount of work in philosophy of neuroscience. You held a position in history and philosophy of science at a top university, University of Pittsburgh. Tell us a little bit about the book and your work that has culminated in the history and philosophy of neuroscience.
Yeah. While I was at Pittsburgh, so I was hired there as an assistant professor. This might be of interest to your audience about how I approached going on the job market. Obviously, I was really lucky and grateful to land this terrific job. But one of the things in that cycle of applications, Ian had suggested that I get book proposals to have this as something solid on my CV. So I hadn't completed the book manuscript as part of this 3-year postdoc. I had papers and drafts, like about the amount of stuff that you would get out of a dissertation, but it wasn't published yet. So he said, well, ultimately I'd said I would turn this into a monograph, so get a book contract on your CV, which I did with MIT Press. So I landed with an offer from Pitt, I think in part because I got this nice book proposal, book contract, but then the tenure requirements that they always had said was that, well, what we ask is sort of 6 publications in 6 years. And then it was never made clear to me how many publications my book would count against. And there's a thing about books, because they don't go through the same peer review process, and then you're dependent on reviews. I thought, you know what, I have to write a bunch of papers as well as finish the book, which I dutifully did.
Really? You made it?
Yeah, I did.
Wow.
Yeah. So I started off on a slightly different strand of research, which is more into philosophy of neuroscience. So instead of being within philosophy of mind, which is what philosophy of perception is ultimately, it's a branch of philosophy of mind, I need to switch track a bit into philosophy of science, looking at neuroscience specifically, because I had a whole bunch of questions and ideas stemming from my experience on the modeling side of my research as a PhD student. That was what I was trained to do. Quite simple models, as I just landed in the lab and had to learn basics of programming MATLAB. But I was, interested in these questions about what do we learn from computational models? Why is this a good approach to the brain? And stemming from work of Peter Mackerman, Carl Craver, and Linley Darden, who'd written that paper in 2000, thinking about mechanisms, was very much like Pittsburgh stuff. Philosophy of neuroscience had been then dominated by the idea that neuroscience is giving us mechanistic explanations. And this didn't sit well with my own experience in the lab of, well, actually, we're doing things with computational models. These don't look like mechanistic explanations. So that started me off on a different series of publications, actually looking into what is computational explanation, how is it different from mechanistic explanation.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, congratulations on meeting the challenge of all those publications too, by the way. I would, it's interesting that I hear some of that advice of like books don't necessarily count in some degree, especially, in history, it's like they're everything. But then with philosophy, it sounds like it counted in terms of demonstrating your expertise as a scholar and as sort of like seeing you as, okay, this is someone who's serious and someone who, so good for going on the job market for sure. But not every university is going to count it necessarily. Right.
Exactly. I mean, I think especially not having the PhD in philosophy, I felt like I really had to turn that chunk of research into a book-length thing. And effectively, it was my second PhD.
Well, Fair enough. Fair enough. So, okay. So, yeah. And so I've looked a little bit about, I haven't read the book, but I've seen I really love this idea and some of the things talking about it in terms of essentially questioning the ability of these different models or these different abstractions and perhaps challenging some of their utility or usefulness and what we might be missing out on. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, the new book, it just came out in March this year, is called The Brain Abstracted.
Yeah.
And the idea I had for that originally when I conceived of it as a book project was just to sort of take the ideas that I developed in these publications and journals and just like make a book length argument for the autonomy of computational explanation. But then the project actually morphed in a different direction as I became actually more not critical of computational explanation, but I reinterpreted what they were telling us about the brain in a much less literal way from the way that I'd been used to, certainly stemming from my scientific training, because if you like, the default approach to how we interpret computational models is one that is very much synergistic with the computational theory of mind. It's almost telling us that when you develop a computational model, say of what neurons are doing in primary visual cortex, then you are simply describing the mathematical function that those neurons themselves are doing. If you think of David Marr's work in vision, that three-level framework of explanation in cognitive science, where the top level is this computational theory and then the middle level is algorithms. So what computational modeling is doing is really giving you those top two levels of describing like the maths that the brain itself computes, and that is implemented either in the wetware in the neurons, or if you're a scientist and you hit upon the right equations, then you can say my computer is running the same functions as the brain itself is performing in specific areas. And as I looked more into this and became more influenced by philosophers of science that had thought more deeply about the role of abstraction and idealization in science, I sort of turned against this computational literalist view and actually towards the idea that what computational descriptions are doing is a very specific kind of idealization of the brain, which means that we shouldn't just interpret them literally. It's like this is telling us essentially what the brain is doing.
I love that. So how often, is this something that you feel... I imagine, idealizations, there are philosophers of science who've made claims regarding idealizations in physics and things like that. Is there something special going on in neuroscience with these things? Or is this something where you've been made sort of making connections where, we see this a lot in science?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think we see this a lot in science, but it's under discussed, I would say, in particular in popular science. Science is written about as if scientists don't ever simplify what they're representing. Though if you have experience being a scientist or even just doing very introductory lectures, say in Newtonian mechanics, you'll know that you're told to leave out so many variables. So it seems extremely central to the scientific method, but not in a way that it's talked about much. So I wanted to foreground this and make it part of the discussion of how we interpret the results of neuroscience, because I think it's a really important factor in what we accept that neuroscience is telling us ultimately about the mind. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with neuroscientific methodology. It's extremely consonant with the methodology of other parts of science. So one of the philosophers of science that I was a fan of, and still a fan of, when I was a PhD student doing my reading around, is Nancy Cartwright. So I really loved her book, The Dappled World, which came out when I was a PhD student. And beginning with this description of the physical environment as extremely complex. We have no guarantee that the laws of physics as we have them are actually able to describe things that are really complicated trajectories in the real world, such as banknote falling in the wind in St. Stephen's Square in Vienna. That's the examples that she gives. At this point, and it goes back to her early work and how the laws of physics lie, that what you're doing in the lab is creating certain situations where you're basically simplifying the physical interactions that are there such that you can apply equations as in the fundamental laws of physics, at least approximately, to these systems, which are close enough to the idealizations which the laws of physics, strictly speaking, only apply to. Wonderful. But those idealizations are not possible. They're not, you couldn't actually have them physically existing.
Right.
But what you do in the lab is approximate to those idealized scenarios. Yeah, so I was really interested in how she, as a philosopher, had written about these methodologies. And I think there was just an imprinting there at the back of my mind. Okay, how do you think about these same set of general issues in neuroscience, which is a very different science from physics? What you're actually having to deal with is actually an object which is extremely complex, much more complex than what physicists often deal with, even though Nancy has explained how complicated those already are, and looking at the variety of methodologies for simplification that neuroscience employs.
Yeah, it's often that even those things that are considered simpler are more complicated than we even realize, and even those things that are sort of complicated are even more complicated than you even thought. I think it is fascinating as someone who is both a student of neuroscience and a consumer of sort of public perceptions of neuroscience. There is this sense that neuroscience is highly detailed, and I think the often is the case when you hear about press releases or discussions from neurobiologists. Of course, there's discussion, but there is this sense that, right, the simplification is certainly not described or often emphasized. It's that we're actually the ones getting into the nitty-gritty detail, or we're the ones that have found this new unique network or pathway, and there's some kind of, so I think in some ways it seems like, whereas maybe folks are just a little bit more comfortable or familiar with the simplifications in physics, that, right, people this is some pretty groundbreaking and forward-thinking work to notice that there's a lot more simplification than that meets the eye or that has been discussed. Do you offer a positive program for neuroscience in terms of, or thinking more about if, is this primarily descriptive in terms of here are all these simplification ways, which I think is very useful and informative. But are there any normative lessons to be learned from the book?
No, I mean, it depends what you mean by normative lessons.
That's fair.
Yeah. It's no part of my book to tell neuroscientists that they should simplify less, or that their models are too abstract. All models, it's in the nature of a model to be an abstraction, and I'm not saying that neuroscientists should stop building models or doing other experimental controls. There's a large part of the book is actually about how experimental design itself is the beginnings of simplification, and that's really important. That's another point sort of borrowed from Cartwright, and I give
so it's more so in a sense it's more of like, the normative lesson is not to the scientists insofar as how they do their work, but certainly how they present the work to the wider world, that they should make this clear. And also for philosophers and other people interested in the science, that they should be more aware of this. And there is this further normative argument, which is for the plurality of methods in the philosophy of mind, pretty much doing a U-turn against the neurophilosophy approach of the Churchland, saying that there is a place for philosophy of mind which is autonomous from scientific results, precisely because there are issues in the philosophy of mind where you might want to avoid the kind of idealizing framework that if you just follow the scientific framing, you'll be forced to accept a bunch of idealizations that maybe for philosophical reasons you won't want to employ. So broadly speaking, the thing that could be important to a philosopher of mind that a scientist would abstract away from is normativity. So the values associated with mental states, cognitive states. Science doesn't want to deal with those. The specific case study I give, and this is the final chapter of the book, is the debate
between Tyler Burge and John McDowell over disjunctivism and philosophy of perception. Which is disjunctivism is a view associated with naive realism and philosophy of perception, which says that there is a fundamental difference between the state you are in when you are correctly viewing an object and when you're non-correctly viewing an object, even if those states could be subjectively indistinguishable to you. And John McDowell is someone who says because of normativity, their role in epistemology, we're entitled to posit a fundamental difference here and theorize perceptual capacities according to this effectively normative split. Tyler Burge says that this is disallowed because it's inconsistent with how scientists model visual processes. And I'm actually arguing for the McDowellian position that it's legitimate to have a view which is autonomous from that scientific framing, precisely because he doesn't need to follow them into this idealizing assumption.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing about this work, and I know I know it's just released. I'm excited to delve into it. I've been meaning to look at. I've seen it up, and I know you've gone on and discussed. So.
You know what? Normally people read the book before the interview. But,
oh God. I know. I'm so sorry.
It's fine with me.
Oh, I've read the book and it's great. Yeah, it's no, I appreciate that. I got to be better on getting at least breaking into a couple chapters and saying, oh yeah, we've read. At least I can pretend like a book reviewer has or something like that. Like, oh yeah,
it's good that you've come clean.
I did. I just want to be honest. I didn't want to pretend or I mean, you were asking me these questions at the beginning. I might get, how did you reflect on chapter 3? What did you think about this argument? Do you think there are any? So I guess maybe just to follow up on the book and then we'll follow up with the last question. How is it, in terms of how has it been received? What kinds of positive critiques or thoughtful engagement have you had with the book? And has that changed? Have you thought a little bit more about it since it's been in the life of philosophy and science?
Yeah. Well, it's always exciting when you publish a book and then you start you start seeing how it's received in the wider world, because writing a book, it's quite a solitary thing. You're in your own head a lot, and then finally it's out there in the world. So I appreciate the people that have read it and responded to it. So I'm still awaiting the first official review from a philosopher of science, in an actual journal. These things happen more slowly. So yeah, if there are any philosophers of science out there want to review it, feel free to.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But no, there was a symposium on it on the Brains blog, which came out in May.
Oh, great. That's a good, that's a really nice blog.
We had a nice discussion there, which is good. So actually, if you, I don't know if you give links on your website, but that's a nice place to go to get summaries of books and some of the main arguments and get responses on those. Definitely that's the most accessible summary of what is going on in the book. And it's been nice actually to hear people from the scientific community as well. Quite a few people have reached out. They're interested in this, done reading groups, and got invited to a workshop in Rotterdam for the Cognitive Science Society just recently, which was on the question of cognitive ontology, but a group of scientists at Indiana actually had found it useful. So I'm really pleased to hear that, because I hadn't written it actually with the view in mind that this is going to help scientists in their day-to-day life and problems, but actually I was pleased that it did have that, at least for some people. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, definitely. Well, I'll definitely provide a link to that. And yeah, I've heard a number of things about the Brains blog as well. It's been really excellent. I've seen some excellent interviews, but it seems like now that I'm looking at it, really definitely have to go check it out. So let's conclude with the final question I ask, which is, what do you see as the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
The The greatest challenge for philosophy of science. So philosophy of science, not philosophy of neuroscience in particular. Philosophy of
Well, this is open-ended. So if you'd like to speak directly, more specifically to philosophy of neuroscience, I'm happy to listen a little bit about that. And those could be epistemic challenges, could also be disciplinary challenges. So however you would like to interpret this question is fine.
No, I mean, I think the thing I would want to say on this question is actually go a bit wider and think about like what is the challenge for philosophy in general at the moment. I think there is like a worry about relevance of the discipline as a whole. If you just look at the position both in academia and in wider social, society-wide intellectual debates compared to 100 years ago, 50 years ago, philosophy is much more marginal, and that seems like a real shame. And the question is, how can philosophy become more relevant again? I think this is something that we should all think a bit more about. And I think thinking about how the professional incentives towards specialization, and everyone is in that certain mill, and I've certainly been through it myself, that you just have to think about ways to keep working in an ever more competitive situation, that it sort of counts against maybe the ways of thinking cross-disciplinarily or contextually that make philosophy compelling to people outside academia and make it connect with those wider debates. And I know that there's this movement for like socially engaged philosophy, so philosophers to be publishing in philosophy journals about issues that are socially engaged, but this isn't quite the issue that I'm talking about. It's really about the salience of philosophy in the wider intellectual landscape.
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's one that I don't know how, right. I appreciate you bringing it up and kind of putting it out there too, because a lot of times when I've asked this question, it's more like philosophy of science needs to do X, and I think there are some good reasons to think more specific to this, but there is that lingering problem and issue related to how do we understand and take philosophy a professional or as some way influential or connected in this grander way. I might touch on, I know we had discussed this a little bit before talking about your connection with thinking about philosophy and in terms of philosophy of life and things like that. Is there any room for bringing connection to philosophy to that, making a connection in that regard? Or should that be seen more as sort of a separate thing in itself?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this does, link quite nicely to this previous point, which is, I think that a lot of what people want from philosophy as a discipline is that, philosophy is that thing that tells you what the meaning of life is. And I know that sounds laughable and it's a cliche, but there is something about philosophy that, in the very least in Suller's term, like seeing how things hang together in the broadest possible way, is meaningful to us as people, to have that sense of where we are, what does this all mean, what do we know, how does it make sense to us, that very general sense making thing. I think it is part of a need that we have of people to make sense of the world and see where we're situated within us. I don't see academic philosophy as the right vehicle for that.
Right.
And I think some of the things that I've been thinking about going back to is using different modalities, different writing forms as actually a vehicle for doing the kind of philosophy that is more meaningful in that wider way. But it takes time, and it's hard to do that while also having all the demands that professional philosophy places on one.
Yeah. So there are almost separate questions to understanding what are the challenges for academic professional philosophy as a discipline versus philosophy in a sort of an unbound way that can tap into the thing.
But I think they are related precisely because the more philosophy seems like not really important to the wider world, the more it is maybe more vulnerable within academia as well.
Right. So if we can find, right. It's so, no, I like thinking it like, I like thinking in that regard. It's just that there's certainly not a simple solution to this to making it more salient and relevant and perhaps important in the wider world in a way that academic philosophy would take in or would adopt in a way that even feels relevant to how it's working. So. Well, Mazviita, thank you so much for coming on and chatting and sharing about your book. Is there anything else you'd like to share or mention or plug or reference before we go?
Well, I should say about the book that it's available open access for the electronic version. It's easy for people just to download a copy and
That's even more not excuse for me not reading it. I should really get that. But wonderful. So it's open access is it at the MIT Press?
Exactly. If you find the book page over there.
Wonderful. The Brain Abstracted, Simplifications in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Chirimuuta, for joining us. It was a pleasure meeting you. Hope to see you in Edinburgh sometime if we ever visit. I'm definitely going to keep that the festival on my radar for something. It's a life goal for sure. And obviously the philosophy of science at your university is top notch. So I hope I can visit someday and meet you in person. Yeah,
certainly. Certainly, We'll go to a play together. Lovely to meet you.
That sounds great. Yeah, it's great to meet you. Have a good rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.